Sometimes the SEC's rules and regulations allow you to furnish something rather than file it. This concept relates to liability, not how you actually send it down, transmit it to the SEC. Today on Zippy Point.
Quick Zips by Zippy Point.
Quick and dirty. I'm Brock Romanek and I'm a big fan of yous. So when I was starting my legal career in the late 1980s, the filed versus furnished distinction was discussed much more frequently than it is today because it was a fairly new concept back then. It was born out of the concern about how the integration of 33 Act and 34 Act filings with the SEC were giving 33 Act liability to disclosures that weren't meant to have that stricter liability standard. So this was an outgrowth of the shelf registration framework and incorporation by reference as facilitated by adoption of Rule 415 in 1983. So this boiled down to the fact that it's easier for a plaintiff to make a claim under the Securities Act than under the Exchange Act. The primary basis for issuer liability under the 33 Act are Sections 11 and Section 12A2. So simple are the elements of the plaintiff's claim and so difficult in issuers' defenses that many refer to Section 11 as imposing strict liability for material misstatements or omissions in registration statements. Companies do have a due diligence defense, however, available for a 12A2 claim. For Exchange Act filings, their primary basis for disclosure of liability is Rule 10b-5 and Section 10b itself. Rule 10b-5 applies to any materially misleading statement or omission made in connection with the purchase or sale of a security. The SEC has interpreted the in connection with requirement very broadly so that virtually any public statement that may be imputed to the company may be a basis for liability under 10b-5. Then there's potential Section 18 liability under the Exchange Act too, but this is rarely used as a claim because there are difficult reliance and causation elements, and a company has a statutory defense can avoid liability if it can prove it acted in good faith and had no knowledge that the statement was false or misleading. A Rule 10b-5 plaintiff must prove causation, reliance on the materially misleading statement or omission, although reliance may be established by the fraud on the market theory, and that the defendant acted with scienter, meaning that the defendant acted knowingly, although some courts have allowed proof of recklessness to suffice. So the upshot is that it's harder for a plaintiff to make out a Rule 10b-5 claim than a claim for liability under the Securities Act under Section 11. Recognizing this, the SEC developed this legal fiction, this legal distinction of furnishing certain documents to the SEC, certain disclosures, essentially meaning that those documents are not considered filed in the legal sense. So at first, the SEC dabbled with this concept by deeming disclosure to be not filed and providing that the disclosure would not become a filing under Sections 13A, Sections 13C, Section 14, and Section 15 of the Exchange Act, and thus would not be deemed to be incorporated by reference into 33 Act registration statements, this whole shelf registration integrated disclosure concept. Then the SEC began to also implement the not filed distinctions for certain disclosures that relate to the proxy season, that relate to the proxy statement. For these furnished disclosures, they're not considered soliciting material or filed with the SEC, so they don't have liability under Section 18 of the Exchange Act. Then the SEC even extended this concept further for CEO certifications under Section 906, which has its own liability standard, criminal liability, because it's a Department of Justice thing. It's a DOJ thing. And as you might recall, the SEC only has civil liability authority. So the things today that are considered furnished but not filed include the stock performance graph, the compensation committee report, the audit committee report, other parts of the glossy annual report that are not specifically incorporated by reference into a Form 10-K, like the annual letter to shareholders from the CEO or from the board chair. Form 8-Ks filed under Item 2.02 relating to earnings releases, and 8-Ks filed under Item 7.01 that are Reg FD disclosures. Of course, all these things still have the potential for Rule 10b-5 liability, so your only benefit is that you're spared a concern over Section 18, which, as I noted earlier, is a rare claim to be brought. Still, less potential liability is better than none. I should mention that you're permitted to expressly change the presumption that something is furnished if you do want it to be considered filed. You do want it to be incorporated by reference into a 33 Act filing, because sometimes you want that to happen so that your disclosure in the 33 Act filing is considered full, so that you don't have any omissions. I should note the mechanics of all this, except for one exception that I'll talk about in a second. All these items above are still actually filed with the SEC on their Edgar database. That's why I keep calling this furnished versus filed concept a legal fiction, a legal distinction, because it has to do with liability. Now, what actually is transmitted electronically to the SEC and posted on the SEC's website on the Edgar database. These furnished documents are still Edgarized and they're still filed in the technical sense, even in Section 906 CEO, CFO certifications, which aren't regulated by the SEC at all, technically, but yet they're made part of the Form 10Qs, the 10Ks that companies filed as part of those periodic reports as an exhibit to them. So they're up there on Edgar because the Department of Justice doesn't have its own electronic database like the SEC does with Edgar. So that's the way the DOJ and the SEC configured it. So the exception is the portions of that glossy annual report that are not considered to be part of the 10K. You can use Exhibit 13 of the Form 10K if you don't include MD&A, the financials itself. You can incorporate by reference those things and file them as an exhibit to the 10K under Exhibit 13 as elicited by Item 601 of Regulation SK. So let me end here by throwing in this excerpt from my Vid-Guide about collecting CEO, CFO certifications. A link to that Vid-Guide is beneath this video, but this excerpt is from the back part of that Vid-Guide where I'm talking to Gunster's Bob Lamb and Primerica's Stacy Gear, because we did talk a little bit in that Vid-Guide about furnished versus filed. So I thought I'd throw that in here as some in-house practical common sense. Enjoy. But we're going to start, Bob, with that weird thing about filed versus furnished when you're new to this field and you're trying to get a handle on what that all means.
Filed versus furnished really is a function of two things. It's liability. If it's filed, you're subject to a greater degree of liability than if it's merely furnished. And also, if it's furnished, you can't, it's not automatically incorporated by reference into your subsequently filed 33 Act documents, if any. You know, I've always felt that the distinction is a little bogus because it's not like you're not subject to any liability for furnished materials. If you have a really bad press release, you're going to get stung on it. But that being said, people are very conscious and conscientious about avoiding liability. So for those who are really concerned about it, that's what you do. You furnish something versus filing it.
And at its most basic level, and technically you still do file this as part of an SEC filing that goes electronically to the SEC.
Yeah,
when I think of the word furnished, I think of someone hand delivering it or
yeah, I mean it's a very highly defined term under the SEC regs, but you include it in a filing. So yes, it's filed, but it's not filed.
Right, it's a legal
in italics or something.
That's what I was going to do. Filed.
Right.